What comes next?
All right. What comes next?
Just do your best.
This is a funny song.
Just do your best.
All right, enough of that. What comes next? What comes next? What comes next? So I want to spend the next, ready for this, 3 slides. 13, 14, and 15. The next 3 slides. Kind of summarizing and maybe extending what these various phases that lead people potentially from recreational exercise activity all the way down to exercise addiction involve. Okay, because I gave you a lot of information, so I want to kind of summarize these phases here. Remember, psychological differences between recreational and at-risk exercisers really focus on the motivation for doing the activity and observable signs, right? We're looking at psychological factors when we talk about motivation. What distinguishes the recreational exerciser from the at-risk exerciser, remember, is the frequency of the motivation that has changed over time. So why are people doing this more frequently in the at-risk category than the recreational category? It's because they are no longer just doing it for the enjoyment of the activity. And that was what the recreational exerciser did. They're doing it more frequently now because of the relief from stress or dysphoric states such as depression and anxiety or irritability, or they're doing it to improve their self-esteem, and without it, they're not really feeling good about themselves anymore. So it goes from being something that adds to one's life and well-being to something that helps them to manage things such as stress or negative emotional states or low self-esteem. Observable signs, remember, for people who move from recreational to at-risk, they're having periodic loss of control in the at-risk phase, whereas in the recreational phase, they had control over when and for how long they did their exercise behavior. And over time, that loss of control is getting even more intense. They're not able to control things as well over time. And they're starting to do the exercise more intensely or more frequently or for longer periods of time than they intended. And another observable sign that separates our recreational exercisers from our at-risk exercises is the negative consequences of exercise begin to increase in frequency. Still as a direct result of the exercise, though, the negative consequences are still about the exercise itself, like a sprained ankle or other physical problems that happen as a result of the increase in exercise behavior. When the primary motivation, this is really important here, when the primary motivation for the activity moves from enjoyment and serving one's life in a positive way to reduction of negative things like emotions that are problematic to handle or improving self-worth that is otherwise low, that's when we start to worry about something moving from recreational to an at-risk category. Researchers have shown that the likelihood of moving eventually to exercise addiction increases statistically for people who exercise with the goal of escaping unpleasant feelings or transforming their self-esteem, as compared to those who exercise with the goal of improving fitness and improving performance. And, the capacity of any behavior, including exercise, to become a coping mechanism will make it more likely that that behavior will continue to increase in frequency and therefore become problematic. The addiction is likely to occur most when your behavior, in this case exercise, becomes the primary or sole means of coping with, again, your internal distress states. So now let's summarize on slide 14. Again, that problematic phase of exercise dependence. This is kind of a critical phase because you're not quite addicted, but you're moving into a problematic pattern that can become addicted. So to summarize, recreational exercisers integrate their daily physical activity into their lives. Problematic exercisers start to organize their life around their day, around their exercise regimen, and that becomes increasingly more rigid. The nature of the negative consequences changes between at risk and problematic. At risk, your negative consequences, your adverse effects are still directly arising from the exercise. In the problematic phase, your negative consequences are becoming what we call secondary negative consequences, where now your own or another person's response to the adverse effects created by your exercise are causing problems, right? So primary negative consequences are a direct result of the exercise, like you sprain an ankle, you pull a muscle, or you're really fatigued. Secondary consequences, which are happening in the problematic phase, are no longer a direct result of the exercise. They're a result of the problems the exercise is causing. And so again, to recap, these are things like significant others feeling like you're spending more time or wanting to spend more time exercising than spending time with them, or you are becoming angry at yourself for getting injuries from your exercise. Remember, once in the problematic phase, people continue to exercise despite having met the stated goal of doing it in the first place, much like the problem drinker who keeps drinking even after the desired stress relief from alcohol has occurred. So someone might successfully run a mile as intended, but keep going for several hours. Remember, in the problematic phase, behavior that was once done socially is now occurring alone. You no longer run with a group of friends. And you can no longer maintain control over the behavior. You're having more difficulty doing that. And the reason, in part, is because in the problematic phase, the individual is beginning to experience uncomfortable, unpleasant withdrawal type symptoms when they stop exercising, irritability, depression, etc. Next, remember, behavior is now not only done for mood altering effects, which is what happens in the at-risk phase, but now we're moving in the problematic phase to using exercise to alleviate withdrawal symptoms. And finally, to summarize the problematic phase, behavior is becoming what we call indiscriminate, meaning even though you might prefer one type or a few types of exercises, if you're too tired to do those because you've been exercising too much, or you have some soreness in your muscles or even pulled something so you can't do that, instead of taking a break and letting yourself heal, you go back and do something else to make sure you're exercising all the time. Next, to summarize on slide 15, when you get to the final stage of addiction, frequency and intensity of exercise continues until the behavior becomes your main life purpose. And you organize literally everything around it. If you're an athlete and you're addicted, you feel the physical rush and sense of gratification like you did before, but you still continue on exercising even if you've already gotten the rush. A behavior that began as a way to make life more bearable by facilitating coping, which was what was happening in previous stages, is now making your life unmanageable. Next, as the life of the addicted person revolves around exercise in this phase, the pleasure of the behavior goes away, and the primary motivation is really avoiding withdrawal, much like in drug and alcohol addiction. It's no longer driven by positive reinforcement, it's driven by negative reinforcement. And finally, to summarize the addiction phase, direct and secondary negative consequences continue to get bigger and mount and more numerous. And those collectively lead to tertiary negative consequences in the form of impairments in daily life functioning and an inability to meet your role obligations. So things like loss of relationships and continuing to blame yourself for injuries and other things associated with your exercise, that's secondary. Those come as a result of primary, like injuring your ankle. Those collectively, the primary, the injury, and the secondary, self-blame and loved ones being frustrated you don't spend time with them, could lead to a tertiary consequence, which is something like becoming clinically depressed. So I'm going to leave that there. That's a summary of everything I've said about the 4 phases of addiction. Make sure you understand the differences. Make sure you understand the indicators at each phase. And then when you do, meet me on slide number 16.